She looked down at my outstretched hand, and I could see her weighing the decision, calculating the cost not just to herself but to me. "One dance," she said finally, placing her gloved hand in mine with a grace that spoke of countless hours of dancing instruction. "But do not say I did not warn you of the consequences." The moment her hand touched mine, I felt a jolt of recognition that had nothing to do with memory and everything to do with destiny. Her fingers were slender and warm through the silk of her gloves, and when she allowed me to lead her onto the dance floor, I noticed she moved with the fluid grace of someone born to this world, despite her current exile from it. The other couples made space for us, though whether out of respect for my rank or horror at my choice of partner, I could not say. As the waltz began and I placed my hand at her waist, I was struck by how perfectly she fit against me, as if we had been dancing together for years rather than mere moments. "What is your name?" I asked as we began to move in time with the music, her burgundy skirts swirling around us like wine in a crystal glass. "Names have power, Your Highness," she replied, following my lead with an ease that spoke of excellent training. "Perhaps it is better that some remain unspoken, at least for now." Her evasion only intrigued me further. We moved together across the polished floor, and I found myself studying her face, searching for clues to her identity. There was something hauntingly familiar about the curve of her cheek, the way she held her head, but the mask concealed too much for certainty. "You dance beautifully," I observed, guiding her through a particularly complex turn that she executed flawlessly. "I was well taught," she said, and there was a note of wistfulness in her voice that suggested happier times, times when such accomplishments mattered for reasons other than survival. "Though I confess it has been some time since I had occasion to use such skills." "That seems a terrible waste," I said, spinning her gently so that her skirts fanned out around her like flower petals. "Talent such as yours should not be hidden away." She laughed, but there was no joy in the sound. "Talent is a luxury, Your Highness. When one falls from grace, more practical concerns take precedence." "And from what grace have you fallen?" I asked boldly, knowing I risked her withdrawal but unable to contain my curiosity. Her steps never faltered, but I felt her stiffen slightly in my arms. "You truly do not know who I am?" "I suspect," I said carefully, "but I would prefer to hear it from you rather than rely on gossip and speculation." She was quiet for several measures of music, and I began to think she would not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, meant for my ears alone. "I am the woman who supposedly stole charity funds meant for orphans," she said, her chin lifting in defiance even as pain flashed in her eyes. "I am the lady who betrayed the trust of society and was cast out for her greed and cruelty. I am, in the eyes of everyone in this room, irredeemable." The way she said it, with such careful control over her emotions, told me more than any protestations of innocence could have. This was a woman who had been wounded deeply, not just by whatever circumstances had led to her disgrace, but by the cruel judgment of those who had once called her friend. "And what do you say you are?" I asked, meeting her gaze directly. For the first time since we had begun dancing, she smiled, and it transformed her entire face, revealing a beauty that had nothing to do with physical features and everything to do with the radiance of her spirit. "I am a woman who knows the value of truth," she said simply, "even when truth is inconvenient, unpopular, or dangerous." "Then we have something in common," I said, pulling her slightly closer as the music swelled around us. For I find myself increasingly intolerant of convenient lies. As we continued to dance, I became aware that we had drawn every eye in the room. Some watched with scandalized fascination, others with outright disapproval, but all watched. I could see Lord Blackwood standing near the refreshment table, his expression unreadable behind his golden mask, but something about his stillness suggested intense concentration. Have you ever been judged by your appearance rather than your character? Share your thoughts below, because I was beginning to understand the corrosive power of such judgment. "You are very kind," my mysterious partner said, "but kindness to me will cost you dearly. Perhaps you should return me to my corner before the damage to your reputation becomes irreparable." "My lady," I said, guiding her through another turn, "I believe my reputation could use a little damage. It has grown far too pristine for my comfort." She laughed then, a real laugh that lit up her eyes and made several nearby dancers turn in surprise. It was clear that laughter had not come easily to her in recent times, and the fact that I could coax it from her felt like a victory worth celebrating. "You are not what I expected," she said, studying my face with those intelligent green eyes. "What did you expect?" "Someone more like them," she said, nodding slightly toward the crowd of nobles who continued to watch our every move. someone who would see only the scandal and not the person beneath it. Then you have been keeping the wrong company, I said firmly. True nobility has nothing to do with titles or bloodlines. The waltz was coming to an end, and I found myself reluctant to release her, to return her to her lonely vigil by the window. As the final notes faded and the couples around us began to separate, she stepped back with a curtsy that was perfect in its execution. "Thank you for the dance, Your Highness," she said, her voice carrying a finality that suggested she expected this to be our only interaction. "It was more kindness than I deserved." "Nonsense," I replied firmly, offering her my arm. "The evening is young, and I find myself in need of refreshment. Perhaps you would join me for some punch?" The shock that crossed her features was almost comical, as if I had suggested we fly to the moon together. Around us, I could hear the sharp intake of breath from several onlookers, and the whispers grew more insistent, like angry wasps disturbed from their nest. "Your Highness," she said carefully, "I fear you do not fully comprehend the magnitude of what you are suggesting. To be seen with me publicly, to acknowledge me so openly, it will have consequences that extend far beyond this evening." I looked around at the sea of scandalized faces, at my father's increasingly purple complexion, at Lady Charlotte who appeared to be on the verge of swooning, and I felt something that might have been liberation surge through my chest. "Let them talk," I said, placing her hand firmly on my arm and beginning to escort her toward the refreshment table. "I have spent 28 years of my life worrying about what they might say. Tonight, I find myself more concerned with what is right than what is expected." As we walked through the crowd, the effect was remarkable. Conversation stopped mid-sentence, fans snapped shut, and several ladies pressed handkerchiefs to their lips as if the very sight of us together might contaminate them. But my mysterious companion held her head high, her bearing regal despite the circumstances, and I found myself admiring her courage more with each step. Lord Blackwood intercepted us before we could reach the punch bowl, materializing from the crowd with the smooth efficiency of a predator. His smile was sharp enough to cut glass, and his eyes held a warning that was clearly intended for me. "Your Highness," he said with an elaborate bow that somehow managed to convey mockery despite its technical perfection. "What an unexpected pleasure to see you here tonight." His gaze shifted to my companion, and his expression grew positively glacial. "Lady Beatrice, how utterly surprising to find you in attendance." So her name was Beatrice. The sound of it suited her perfectly, classical and elegant, with an undertone of strength. But the way Blackwood spoke it, with such pointed emphasis, made it clear that her presence here was not merely unexpected but actively unwelcome. "Lord Blackwood," she replied with icy politeness, and I noticed her hand tighten almost imperceptibly on my arm. "I trust you are well." "Indeed," he said, his smile never wavering but his eyes growing colder. "Though I confess myself puzzled by your presence here tonight. I was under the impression that you had developed a preference for more humble accommodations." The cruelty in his words was evident, designed to remind her and everyone within earshot of her reduced circumstances. I felt anger surge through me at his deliberate attempt to humiliate her, and I stepped slightly closer to Beatrice in a gesture of support. "Lady Beatrice is my guest this evening," I said clearly, my voice carrying enough authority to make several nearby conversations cease entirely. "I trust that all present will treat her with the respect due to any lady under my protection." The silence that followed my words was deafening. I had just publicly aligned myself with the most scandalous woman in the room, and everyone knew it. Blackwood's expression shifted subtly, surprise giving way to something that might have been calculation. "Of course, Your Highness," he said smoothly. "I would never presume to question your judgment in such matters." But his eyes promised that this conversation was far from over. As Blackwood melted back into the crowd, Beatrice turned to me with an expression of wonder mixed with concern. "You should not have done that," she said quietly. "You have made yourself a target now, aligned yourself with someone society has deemed unfit for their company." "Good," I replied, surprising myself with the vehemence of my response. "Perhaps it is time someone challenged their precious society and its arbitrary judgments." We reached the refreshment table, and I served her a glass of punch with my own hands, another breach of protocol that sent fresh waves of shock through the assembled guests. As I handed her the crystal cup, our fingers brushed, and I felt that same electric connection that had sparked during our dance. "You asked me what I say I am," she said quietly, taking a delicate sip of the punch. "But what I am and what I can prove are two different things entirely." "Then tell me what you can prove," I said, moving closer so that our conversation would remain private despite the many ears straining to hear our words. She was quiet for a long moment, studying the ruby liquid in her glass as if it might contain answers to questions she had been asking for months. "I can prove that I loved those children as if they were my own," she said finally, her voice thick with emotion. "I can prove that every penny I raised for the orphanage went exactly where it was supposed to go. I can prove that I have documentation of every transaction, every donation, every expenditure." Her voice grew stronger as she continued. "What I cannot prove is who actually stole the money, or why they chose to place the blame on me." The pain in her voice was unmistakable, and I found myself wanting to gather her into my arms and promise that everything would be made right. Instead, I set down my own glass and turned to face her fully. "Then we shall have to find a way to prove the rest," I said simply. Her eyes widened in shock. "We?" "Lady Beatrice," I said, and speaking her name felt like claiming something precious. "I may not know the full truth of what happened to you, but I am an excellent judge of character. The woman I danced with tonight, the woman who has faced such cruelty with such dignity, is not capable of the crimes they accuse her of." Tears gathered in her eyes, though she blinked them back with fierce determination. "You cannot know that. You have known me for less than an hour." "Sometimes," I said, remembering the way she had felt in my arms, the way her laughter had transformed her entire being, "an hour is enough." The orchestra had begun another set, and couples were forming for a country dance. I noticed that Charlotte was being led onto the floor by Lord Pemberton's eldest son, a man with all the personality of week-old bread, but she kept glancing in my direction with an expression of wounded indignation. "Your intended bride appears distressed," Beatrice observed, following my gaze. "She is not my intended anything," I said firmly. "She is my father's choice, not mine." "And what is your choice?" she asked, and there was something in her voice, a note of hope that she was trying desperately to suppress. I looked at her then, really looked at her, taking in the elegant curve of her neck, the way the candlelight caught the auburn highlights in her hair, the intelligence and courage that shone from her eyes despite everything she had endured. "My choice," I said slowly, "is standing right here." The words hung between us like a bridge across an impossible chasm, and for a moment the ballroom, the scandal, the watching eyes, all of it faded away until there was nothing but the two of us and the truth I had just spoken. "Edmund," she whispered, and the sound of my name on her lips was like music. If you're enjoying this tale of love conquering social prejudice, subscribe to our channel for more inspiring historical romances. But our moment of connection was shattered by the approach of my father, his face a thundercloud of barely controlled rage. The Duke of Valmont was not a man accustomed to having his will crossed, particularly not in such a public manner. "Edmund," my father said, his voice low and dangerous, the kind of tone that had made grown men tremble in the House of Lords. "A word, if you please." It was not a request, and we all knew it. I felt Beatrice begin to step away, preparing to spare me the inevitable confrontation, but I caught her hand gently. "Father," I said, inclining my head respectfully but making no move to abandon Beatrice's side. "I trust you are enjoying the evening's festivities." His eyes, cold as winter steel, flicked between Beatrice and myself, taking in our joined hands with obvious displeasure. "Indeed. Though I confess myself somewhat confused by the choice of company I observe." "Then allow me to present Lady Beatrice Ashford," I said formally, my voice carrying clearly enough for the surrounding crowd to hear every word. "Lady Beatrice, my father, the Duke of Valmont." Beatrice executed a perfect curtsy, her training evident in every graceful movement, but my father's acknowledgement was the barest nod of recognition, his face a mask of barely concealed contempt. "Lady Ashford," he said, her name falling from his lips like something distasteful. "How unexpected to see you here this evening." "Your Grace," she replied with dignity that put his rudeness to shame. "Thank you for your gracious welcome." The irony in her words was subtle but unmistakable, and I saw my father's jaw tighten. He was accustomed to intimidating people, to having his disapproval crush opposition before it could fully form, but Beatrice met his gaze steadily, unflinching in the face of his hostility. "Edmund," he said again, "I believe Lady Charlotte is expecting the next dance." "I am afraid Lady Charlotte will be disappointed," I replied evenly. "I am otherwise engaged." The muscle in my father's jaw began to tick, a sure sign that his famous temper was approaching its breaking point. Around us, the whispers grew more urgent, and I could see that we had become the center of a drama that would be discussed in drawing rooms across Yorkshire for months to come. "Perhaps," Beatrice said quietly, "it would be best if I took my leave. The evening has been more pleasant than I had any right to expect." "Nonsense," I said firmly. "The evening is far from over, and I have yet to hear the full story of your circumstances. Would you join me for a stroll in the portrait gallery? The air in here has grown rather stifling. My father's face had progressed from merely displeased to actively dangerous, but I was past caring about his political machinations and social maneuvering. For the first time in my adult life, I had found someone, worth fighting for. Edmund, he said, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more threat than any shout, you are making a grave mistake. This woman is ruined, completely beyond redemption. Any association with her will destroy everything we have worked to build. Then perhaps, I said, meeting his gaze directly, it is time to build something better. I offered Beatrice my arm, and after a moment's hesitation, she accepted it. Together, we walked away from my father, from the scandalized crowd, from the suffocating weight of expectation that had defined my entire existence. The portrait gallery was blessedly empty, its long walls lined with generations of noble ancestors whose painted eyes seemed to follow our progress. Tall windows looked out onto the snow-covered gardens, where moonlight turned the landscape into something from a fairy tale. Here, away from the crushing judgment of society, I could finally breathe. You have just destroyed your relationship with your father, Beatrice said as we stopped before a portrait of some long-dead duke, her voice heavy with concern. For someone you barely know. I know enough, I said, turning to face her fully. I know that you have been wronged, and that no one has bothered to seek the truth because it was easier to accept the lie. She moved to the window, pressing her gloved hand against the cold glass as she stared out at the winter night. In the moonlight, she looked ethereal, like a figure from a poem about lost love and noble sacrifice. You want the truth, she said without turning around. Very well. I will give it to you, though I warn you that it is uglier than you might expect. I waited, understanding that she needed to tell this story in her own way, in her own time. I dedicated 3 years of my life to the Ashford orphanage, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. It was built with funds from my inheritance, on land that had belonged to my family for generations. Those children became my world, my purpose, my greatest joy. She turned from the window then, and I could see tears glistening in her eyes despite her efforts at composure. We raised substantial funds through charity events, donations from wealthy patrons, even contributions from Parliament itself. Every penny was accounted for, documented, verified. I kept meticulous records because I understood the importance of transparency when dealing with public trust. What happened? I asked gently, though I suspected I already knew where this story was leading. Lord Blackwood happened, she said, and the name fell from her lips like a curse. He had been one of our most generous benefactors, or so I thought. He began making increasingly personal overtures, invitations to private dinners, suggestions that my work would benefit from his closer supervision. I felt my hands clench into fists at her words, understanding beginning to dawn like a sickening sunrise. When I refused his advances, when I made it clear that our relationship would remain strictly professional, he became quite vindictive. Suddenly, there were discrepancies in the accounts, money that could not be located, accusations of mismanagement. He framed you, I said, the words heavy with certainty. Brilliantly, she replied with bitter admiration. He had positioned himself as the primary overseer of our finances, had access to all the accounts, all the records. When the money disappeared, who else could be blamed but the naive young woman who had clearly been in over her head? But surely there was some way to prove your innocence? She laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. Prove it how? With what evidence? By that time, Blackwood had destroyed or altered every document that might have exonerated me. My own servants, people I had employed for years, suddenly developed selective memory about financial transactions they had witnessed. He bought them off. Or threatened them. Blackwood is a powerful man with a long reach and a longer memory for slights. No one was willing to risk their livelihood, their family's security, for someone already marked for destruction. I began to pace the length of the gallery, my mind working furiously. There must be something, some record he could not destroy, some witness he could not silence. I have spent the better part of a year searching for exactly that, she said wearily. I have followed every lead, investigated every possibility, but Blackwood is too careful, too thorough. He left no loose ends. Except one, I said, stopping abruptly as a thought struck me. What do you mean? He left you alive, I said, turning to face her with growing excitement. If he had truly been thorough, if he had wanted to ensure his secret died with your reputation, he would have found a way to silence you permanently. The fact that you are still here, still fighting, still seeking the truth, suggests that somewhere there is evidence that even he cannot reach. Hope flickered in her eyes before she quickly suppressed it. You are grasping at shadows, Edmund. I have exhausted every possibility. Have you? I asked, moving closer to her. Have you considered that the evidence might not be hidden but hiding in plain sight? That perhaps Blackwood's very confidence in his victory might be his weakness? Before she could respond, we heard footsteps approaching along the gallery's polished floor. We turned to see Blackwood himself emerging from the shadows near the far end of the room, his golden mask gleaming in the moonlight like the face of some malevolent deity. How touching, Blackwood said, his voice carrying clearly through the empty gallery as he approached with predatory grace. A prince and his fallen lady, discussing matters that are far better left buried. I stepped protectively in front of Beatrice, though she moved to stand beside me rather than behind me, her courage evident even in the face of the man who had destroyed her life. Lord Blackwood, I said coldly. I was not aware that eavesdropping was among your many talents. He smiled, that cold expression that never reached his eyes. I prefer to think of it as staying informed about matters that concern me. And Lady Ashford's activities, wherever they may occur, are very much my concern. Your concern? Beatrice spoke for the first time since his arrival, her voice steady despite the tension radiating from her frame. I was under the impression that you had washed your hands of any association with me. My dear Beatrice, he said, and the familiar way he spoke her name made my jaw clench, you misunderstand entirely. I take a very personal interest in ensuring that certain truths remain properly buried. Your disgrace, after all, serves a greater purpose than your injured pride. The threat in his words was unmistakable, and I felt something cold and dangerous settle in my chest. This man had not merely destroyed Beatrice's reputation for personal revenge, he had done it to protect something larger, something that made her continued silence a matter of vital importance to him. What truth could possibly justify what you have done to her? I demanded, though I suspected I was beginning to understand the scope of his crimes. Blackwood's smile widened, becoming genuinely amused for the first time that evening. Your Highness, you are even more naive than I had anticipated. Did you truly believe that a few £1,000s missing from an orphanage was worth destroying a woman's entire existence? That level of vindictiveness would be excessive even for someone of my reputation. He began to circle us slowly, like a cat toying with mice, his hands clasped behind his back in a gesture that might have appeared casual to any observer who could not see the predatory gleam in his eyes. The orphanage money was merely the beginning, he continued conversationally. A convenient excuse to discredit someone who had become inconveniently observant about certain parliamentary appropriations, certain charitable endeavors that serve multiple purposes. You have been stealing from government coffers, Beatrice said, understanding dawning in her voice. Such an ugly word, stealing, Blackwood replied with mock offense. I prefer to think of it as redirecting resources toward more practical applications. The war effort requires funding, after all, and not all of that funding can be obtained through traditional channels. I felt the pieces clicking into place with horrifying clarity. You have been embezzling military funds, using charity organizations as fronts for your operations. Among other things, he admitted with the casual air of a man discussing the weather. The beauty of charity work is that it generates such warm feelings, such trust. People are remarkably careless about oversight when they believe they are contributing to a worthy cause. And when Beatrice began asking questions about financial discrepancies, you realized she posed a threat to your entire operation, I concluded. Precisely, he said, stopping directly in front of us. Lady Ashford has always been regrettably intelligent, regrettably thorough in her record-keeping. It became clear that her continued involvement in charitable work could prove problematic. So you framed her, I said, my voice thick with disgust. I solved a problem, he corrected. Rather elegantly, I thought. Her fall from grace served as both punishment for her interference and warning to others who might be tempted to ask inconvenient questions. Beatrice had gone very still beside me, and when I glanced at her, I could see that her mind was working furiously, processing everything Blackwood had just revealed. You made a mistake, she said quietly, and there was something in her voice that made both Blackwood and me turn our full attention to her. I beg your pardon. You made a mistake, she repeated, her voice growing stronger. In your arrogance, in your certainty that you had won completely, you just confessed to crimes far more serious than simple embezzlement. For the first time since his arrival, Blackwood's confident expression flickered with uncertainty. You have no proof of anything I have said here tonight. Perhaps not, she agreed, but I do have this. She reached into her reticule and withdrew a small leather journal. Its pages worn from careful handling. Do you remember this, Lord Blackwood? You insisted I keep detailed records of all our financial meetings, all our discussions about fund allocation. His face had gone very pale behind his golden mask. Those records were destroyed. The official records, yes, she said with a smile that was sharp as a blade. But I always kept personal notes as well, insurance against exactly this sort of situation. Every meeting, every conversation, every suspicious transaction is documented here, including several very interesting discussions about military contracts and government appropriations. Give me that book, he demanded, lunging toward her, but I stepped between them, my hand moving instinctively to where my sword would hang if this were not a social occasion. I think not, I said coldly. Lady Ashford's property will remain in her possession. You do not understand, Blackwood snarled, his careful composure finally cracking. That book contains information that could bring down half the government. There are men far more powerful than either of you who will not allow their secrets to be exposed. Then perhaps, I said, those men should have chosen their associates more carefully. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the gallery, and we turned to see my father striding toward us, his face thunderous with rage. Behind him came several other guests, including Lord Pemberton and, to my surprise, Lady Charlotte herself. Edmund, my father barked, this has gone quite far enough. You will return to the ballroom immediately and fulfill your social obligations. Actually, father, I said, my voice carrying a calm certainty that surprised even me, I believe my obligations lie elsewhere tonight. I turned to Beatrice, seeing the hope and determination shining in her eyes, and made the decision that would change both our lives forever. Lady Ashford, I said formally, loud enough for all the approaching witnesses to hear, would you do me the honor of accepting my proposal of marriage? The silence that followed was deafening. My father's face went from red to purple to white in the space of seconds. Lady Charlotte gasped audibly, her fan clattering to the marble floor. But Beatrice, my brave, brilliant Beatrice, smiled with pure joy. Yes, she said simply, and the word rang through the gallery like a bell. Yes, I will marry you. As spring arrived 3 months later, bringing with it new life and new beginnings, Beatrice and I stood together in the small church near my estate, surrounded by the people who had come to love and respect her as I did. The evidence in her journal had not only cleared her name but had exposed a network of corruption that reached into the highest levels of government. Lord Blackwood was awaiting trial in the Tower of London, and the stolen funds had been recovered and returned to their rightful purposes. But more importantly, I had learned that true nobility comes not from birth or title, but from the courage to stand up for what is right, even when the cost is high. Love had taught me that some things are worth fighting for, worth sacrificing for, worth changing everything for. If this story of courage and true love inspired you, subscribe to our channel and share it with someone who needs to hear that love conquers all. Because sometimes, in the darkness of winter, we find the warmth that will carry us through to spring.